Dad, she's on my flight. The words cracked through the phone like a dropped glass on tile, sharp enough to slice the air between us. My son's voice carried the soft static hum of altitude, a hollow roar behind every syllable. Grace was supposed to be here, in this house, tucking a quilt over my legs, brewing my evening tea. Instead, Daniel was calling from 30,000 feet, saying she'd just settled into seat 3A on his flight to New York City. She told me she'd be home, taking care of you, he said, quieter now, like he was afraid the cabin walls could listen. I felt my pulse knock against the seam of my chest, right where the surgeon's scar still burned like a stitched-up sunrise. Before you continue, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where and when you're watching. The house greeted me with nothing but its own breath. No shoes by the door, no kettle humming on the stove, just the tick of the wall clock above the kitchen archway, each second landing like a nail. I climbed the stairs slowly, the wood groaning under my weight, as if it, too, was tired of holding things up. Her side of the bed was perfectly smooth, a slab of untouched white. The pillow stood like an untouched monument. She hadn't just left, she'd erased herself. I lowered myself onto the mattress, careful not to wrinkle the sheets, as though touching them might make the truth collapse in on itself. The smell of her lavender lotion was fading, slipping away like steam off a mirror. "Daniel," I murmured when he picked up again. "Was she alone?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear the static of the flight deck. "She had a man with her," he said finally, voice flattening. "Tall, dark coat. They didn't speak, but they didn't have to." My fingers dug into the edge of the mattress. A seam popped beneath my thumb. For 20 years, I thought we were building a life here. Board by board, brick by brick. Now it felt like the house had been built out of playing cards, and someone had just exhaled. On the dresser, an old photo of us at Lake Eufaula tilted slightly. In it, I'm holding her hand like it was a compass, as if she could keep me from getting lost. But even compasses lie when the magnet inside them is cracked. This was no misunderstanding. This was calculated, quiet, deliberate, the kind of slow-burning betrayal only true deceit can perfect. Downstairs, the oxygen concentrator clicked on automatically. The sound echoed through the hollow rooms like a distant, stubborn heartbeat. I followed it, because it was the only thing left in this house that still seemed to remember I was alive. The screen lit my face in the dark like a cold moon. I logged into our joint account, my fingers trembling just enough that I mistyped the password twice. Then it opened, and the number at the bottom corner was smaller than the shadow it cast. 12,347.81. 2 days ago, it had read 200,691.81. The withdrawals sat stacked like tombstones. $50,000 wired to an escrow firm in Manhattan, $30,000 transferred to a shell company named Morningside Realty Group, then $120,000 gone in one quiet sweep labeled simply external transfer. For a long time, I didn't breathe. The cursor blinked on the screen, a single pulse on a flat line. I pressed the phone to my ear. Daniel answered on the second ring. "Dad, what's wrong?" "She didn't just leave, Daniel," I said. My voice came out thin, as if squeezed through wire. "She opened the safe while I was under anesthesia." There was silence, and then the soft hiss of air through his teeth. "Are you saying she took everything?" "I'm saying," I whispered, "that she stripped the house before the body inside it got cold." I leaned back in the chair, and it creaked like old bones. This was more than betrayal. It was arithmetic. She hadn't broken my heart. She'd balanced her books. The walls seemed to fold in, the paint sagging under the weight of her absence. I saw our years together scattered like loose change in a storm drain, too far to reach, too small to matter. And yet, somewhere in the echo of the house, I heard my younger self promising her forever. Maybe this is what family drama really means. Not shouting in kitchens, but the sound of quiet erasures, the subtraction of love in slow, deliberate strokes. The night returns in fragments. Warm light, soft music from the radio in the corner, the faint clink of cutlery, as if everything were perfectly normal. Grace sat across from me at our dining table, the one with the scratch across its surface where Daniel had once carved his initials when he was 12. She had dressed carefully, even though it was just dinner at home. Hair curled, a silk blouse the color of burnt honey. She served me roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, the same meal she always made on holidays, as though she were trying to summon a memory and live inside it. I watched her movements, precise and graceful, while the scent of lemon oil floated around us like a ghost of old celebrations. "You'll need to keep your strength up," she said, setting a linen napkin beside my plate. "I'm going to the shops tomorrow. Vitamins, warmer blankets, maybe some scented candles. The house needs to feel alive again." I cut into the chicken, though I couldn't taste anything. "Alive," I repeated. "That's what you want the house to be?" She smiled in that slow, careful way of hers. "It has felt like a hospital lately. I want to bring the light back." I studied her face. It was the same face I had woken up beside for 25 years, but it felt like I was looking at a painting. Beautiful. Still. And suddenly, not mine. There was a distance in her eyes, the kind that makes you want to shout just to see if the sound will reach. "Grace," I said quietly, "are you planning to care for me, or planning to leave?" The fork paused halfway to her lips. Then she laughed softly, almost kindly. "Robert," she said, "why would you even ask that?" I didn't answer, because deep down, some part of me already knew. There was a packed suitcase in her car trunk. I'd seen the handle sticking out from beneath a blanket when I went to take the trash out earlier. I'd told myself it was nothing, the way people tell themselves the tide won't come in just because they aren't ready to swim. We finished dinner with polite words, like strangers sharing a table in a quiet cafe. I remember her clearing the plates, humming under her breath as she rinsed them, the sound barely louder than the faucet's whisper. It all seemed so gentle, so domestic. But now, in this silence, I understand. The dinner wasn't nourishment. It was camouflage. The rosemary, the warm light, the silk blouse, they were the stage dressing of her exit. I thought she was buying things to care for me. She was buying time to disappear. The payment line chilled me more than the name. Charged to R. Stevens Platinum Credit. I stared at it. The soft blue glow of the screen bleeding across the kitchen tiles, washing the room in a color that didn't belong to this house. She hadn't just left me. She'd taken my name with her like a stolen passport. I called Daniel immediately. He picked up before the first ring finished. "Dad," he said quickly, "I didn't want to alarm you, but she used my card," I cut in. "My name, my credit. Did you see who she was with?" Daniel hesitated. I could hear the muted clatter of meal trays behind him, the metallic whisper of the galley door. "I saw a man," he said finally. "Tall gray suit, no ring. They didn't sit together, but they walked like they knew how to." I closed my eyes. The words landed heavier than they should have. This wasn't just betrayal. It was identity theft of the heart. On the counter beside me, the pile of medical bills shifted slightly in the breeze from the air vent, as though they were listening. $45,000 in surgery costs. $12,000 left in the bank. $200,000 gone, silently relocated to a life I wasn't invited into. "Dad," Daniel said gently, "what are you going to do?" I looked at the name on the boarding pass again. Grace's name, printed above my card number, perfectly aligned as though the system itself believed the lie. "I don't know," I said. "But I can't let her rewrite the story while I'm still breathing." Even as I said it, a strange calm settled over me. There is a moment in every family drama when grief hardens into resolve and a man becomes something new, not out of rage, but out of the unbearable weight of being erased. The email arrived just after midnight, its subject line plain enough to almost go unnoticed. Escrow confirmation. I opened it half expecting a mistake, some clerk's misfire. But the words were precise, polished, and unmistakably hers. Deposit received, $120,000. Property, 58W, Mornings at Avoy, New York City. The address sat there in black serif letters, small but sharp, and I felt them cut across my chest one by one. Each number was a blade, each period a nail. I clicked the attachment, an invoice stamped with the date from just 2 days after my surgery. While I was lying in a recovery room surrounded by wires and beeping monitors, Grace had been wiring away our life to a zip code I had never seen. The apartment photos scrolled across the screen like a silent confession. Glass walls, white marble counters, a skyline view of the river. There were champagne flutes on the island counter in the listing photos, as if the place had been built for celebrating other people's heartbreaks. I reached for the pen on my desk and wrote the address on an old envelope, the ink cutting through the paper like it couldn't wait to be free. Then I sat back, staring at it. Morningside, I whispered to the empty room. What a name. It sounded almost gentle, a place for morning light, for soft beginnings. But for me, it was the place where everything had ended. I pressed call. Daniel answered, his voice blurred with exhaustion. She bought an apartment, I said. There was a pause. In Manhattan? Yes, with our money. Are you sure it's her? She used my card, my account, my name. She's building a life out of pieces she stole from mine. The silence on the line felt heavier than words. Somewhere, a train moaned in the distance, and the sound seemed to carry everything I had lost away with it. This was no simple betrayal. This was architecture. She had drawn up plans for my absence and built them into walls I would never see. And now that address was carved into my mind, an open wound disguised as a location pin. I found him by accident, or maybe by inevitability, the kind of inevitability that lives in the margins, waiting for you to be desperate enough to start reading them. His name appeared at the bottom of the escrow invoice, Victor Lane, licensed real estate broker. A few clicks led me through a trail of curated smiles and skyline sunsets, all wrapped in the sharp geometry of luxury listings. But buried deeper, past the staged lofts and candlelit terraces, there it was, a photo of Grace. She was standing beside him in a lobby of glass and gold. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as he held a leather portfolio. He was tall, composed, his smile shaped like a secret. And Grace. Grace was glowing, the way people do when they've chosen a world and it isn't yours. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. My oxygen machine hummed behind me, steady and indifferent, as if to remind me I was still here, still breathing, even if it felt like drowning. When I was breathing through tubes, I whispered to no one, she was smiling at him. Daniel's text came through just then. Any update? I typed back I found him, and deleted it before sending. What would that solve? Naming the ghost doesn't make it disappear. On Victor's profile, there were congratulatory comments from clients. Visionary, trustworthy, relentless. Words I once believed belonged to Grace, too. Now they read like synonyms for deceit. It hit me then. Not all betrayals come with slammed doors or raised voices. Some arrive in pressed suits and soft lighting, with contracts instead of confessions. And when they take what's yours, they make it look like they're giving you something instead. I shut the laptop slowly, like closing a coffin. The house around me seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for this moment. Somewhere out there, Grace was already living her new life in polished marble and glass, while I sat among peeling paint and unpaid bills. But I wasn't done, not yet. I stared at my own reflection in the dark screen before the call connected. Creased face, hospital pallor, the faint ghost of surgical tape still shadowing my chest. Then her face bloomed onto the display, glowing and smooth in the pale light of some sleek hotel lamp. "Robert," she said, as if the word itself were tedious. "Grace," I answered. "You seem well rested. Amazing what betrayal does for the skin." Her mouth twitched. "You always did mistake worry lines for devotion." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes life becomes such a parody of itself you either laugh or sink through the floor. "Let's skip the small talk," I said. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice $200,000 disappearing while I was too drugged to spell my own name?" Her expression didn't flicker. She reached off screen, sipped from a stemmed glass, and placed it back with surgical precision. You were asleep, Robert. Practically gone. I thought, why not make use of what's left? The words hung there, clinical and unbothered, like she was discussing furniture. You drained our life, I said. I repurposed it, she corrected. And honestly, I'm surprised you didn't expect it. You spent years choosing your job over me. Consider this. Balance. I tilted my head, studying her as if she were a puzzle I'd bought missing half the pieces. Balance, I echoed. Is that what they're calling theft now? Her tone chilled, the silk slipping away to reveal the steel underneath. You're going to die, Robert. Maybe not tonight, maybe not next week, but soon. And when you do, all this money would just sit there. I intend to live. Someone should. There was a soft laugh in my throat that escaped before I could stop it. Sharp. Bitter. The sound of something cracking. Well, I said, at least you didn't bother with flowers first. Most grave robbers do. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't reply. She simply closed the laptop with the quiet finality of a coffin lid. The screen went black, and suddenly it was just me again, alone, staring at my own reflection like a man who'd been erased in real time. But in the hollow that followed her silence, something strange flickered to life inside me. Not grief, not even rage. Something quieter, colder. Maybe this is how revenge stories begin, not with shouting, but with the whisper of a man deciding he will not be buried politely. The pain didn't crash in like thunder. It crept. Slow, tight, a fist closing around the center of my chest. The heart monitor beside my recliner lit up in angry red, beeping in sharp little bursts like it was scolding me for remembering too much at once. I pressed my palm against the scar that ran like a zipper down my chest. It felt warm under my fingertips, pulsing unevenly, stubborn as an old engine refusing to quit. This is not how it ends, I whispered. The house stayed silent, as if waiting to see if I meant it. I forced myself to sit up, slow and deliberate, like a man lifting the weight of his entire past off his ribcage. The bank statements lay spread across the table, their neat black numbers gleaming like rows of teeth. 200,000 gone, a marriage gone. The years I'd spent working oil rigs in Texas summers, saving every spare dollar. Gone. But not me. Not yet. I thought of Grace's words, "You're going to die," and felt something colder than rage settle inside me. She thought this was the end of a chapter. She didn't know I was about to rewrite the book. I dialed Daniel. He answered on the first ring. "Dad, are you okay? You sound—" "I'm not okay," I said. "I'm alive. That's better." There was a pause, then a breath. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing yet. Just believe me, because no one else will." He didn't hesitate. "Always." When the call ended, the house felt less empty. I looked back at the bank statements. The paper curled slightly at the corners, as if recoiling from what they held. She had reduced me to numbers, but I was done being an equation. This wouldn't be rage. It would be method. It wouldn't be fire. It would be gravity. Slow, patient, inevitable. And maybe that's how a revenge story truly begins. Not with fury, but with a single heartbeat that refuses to stop, just so it can outlast the lie. Marcy Doyle's office smelled like legal pads and ambition. Clean, sharp, the kind of place where even the air seemed cross-examined before it was allowed in. She sat across from me behind a walnut desk that looked like it could have been used to sign peace treaties. A single silver pen lay dead center, perfectly aligned. "You've had a heart attack," she said matter-of-factly, flipping open a folder. "And now your wife has stolen 200 grand. Most couples fight over thermostat settings, Robert. You two are rewriting the concept of irreconcilable differences." "I've always been an overachiever," I said. My attempt at humor landed somewhere between a wince and a cough. Her lips twitched. Almost a smile, or maybe gas. "We need proof. Transfers, dates, signatures. I want 6 months of bank statements, full credit card histories, and any emails showing authorization, or the lack of it." I handed her a folder so thick it could have doubled as a doorstop. She leafed through it with surgical efficiency, pages snapping like verdicts. She used my name, I said quietly. She used your trust, Marcy corrected, not looking up. Names are just labels. Trust is currency. Her words hit harder than they should have. Maybe because I knew she was right. Grace hadn't just taken the money. She'd weaponized the years I'd spent believing she wouldn't. Marcy slid a legal pad toward me. I'll draft a complaint for financial misappropriation and marital fraud. It won't be fast, and it won't be pretty. But if you're patient, we can freeze her assets before she redecorates that Manhattan apartment in your blood, sweat, and equity. I almost smiled. And here I thought lawyers didn't do poetry. Poetry doesn't bill by the hour, she replied dryly. Her pen began to move, scratching a future onto the page where mine had been erased. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to air in my lungs. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was motion. Somewhere under the fatigue and scar tissue, my heart thudded once, like an old drum remembering the rhythm. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was strategy. And strategy was how men like me climbed back from graves dug by wedding vows. Even in the calm of her office, I could feel the story sharpening. Less a collapse now, more the prelude to a counterattack. And maybe that's what makes family drama so dangerous. It doesn't explode. It reloads. Marcy called me 3 days later, her voice crisp and humming with the kind of energy people get when they've just pulled the curtain off a magician's trick. I traced it, she said without preamble. Every cent. And Robert, she didn't just spend your money, she laundered it. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pale dent her coffee mug had left in the wood months ago, like a fossilized lie. Explain, I said, though my mouth felt dry. Grace wired the funds to a holding account under Morningside Realty Group, Marcy continued, papers shuffling in the background. That's a shell company. No office, no employees, just a post office box and a logo, owned entirely by a trust registered to one man. Victor, I said. Victor, she confirmed. He moved the money through that trust to make it look like investor capital. Then it resurfaced as a cash purchase for the apartment on Morningside Avenue. You didn't just buy her a place to live, Robert. You bankrolled their entire fantasy. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. It sounded cracked, like a hinge in need of oil. So, I said, while I was watching my heart rate spike in post-op, she was watching the market rate spike in Manhattan. This isn't just infidelity, Marcy said, her tone sharpening. This is financial fraud. And if we can prove collusion, it becomes racketeering. That's prison time. The word hung in the air like the smell of ozone before lightning. Prison. For Grace, who once cried when a squirrel fell off our fence. Are you sure? I asked quietly. I'm a lawyer, she replied. I'm never sure. But I'm thorough. Something shifted in me then. Not triumph, not yet, but the faint click of gears beginning to mesh. The story was no longer just about betrayal. It was about systems, laws, consequences. She had played the part of the grieving caretaker so convincingly. But beneath the performance had been contracts, signatures, and the cold arithmetic of deceit. I looked down at my scar, felt its slow, stubborn throb. My heart had always been fragile, but maybe that was what made it dangerous now. It still worked, and I wasn't done. The bank lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and apprehension. I sat beside Marcy in a row of leather chairs that squeaked if you breathed too hard, while the receptionist's eyes flicked up at us like she was afraid we might start a coup. The branch director finally appeared, Mr. Collins, compact and polished, with a tie so tight it could have been welded on. He ushered us into a glass-walled office, the kind designed to make you feel visible and powerless at the same time. Marcy didn't bother with pleasantries. She slid a folder across the desk. We're here to request an immediate freeze on the joint accounts belonging to Robert and Grace Stevens, she said. We have evidence of unauthorized transfers totaling over $200,000. Collins adjusted his glasses with the sort of precision reserved for bomb defusal. Without a court order, our hands are tied. You mean your hands are full? Marcy replied evenly. Full of my client's money. I watched him flinch, just slightly, like someone had stepped on the hem of his composure. "Mr. Stevens," he said, turning to me with the patient tone usually reserved for patients. "If your wife is listed as a joint account holder, she has full withdrawal rights unless proven otherwise in court. If you obtain a judicial order, we will cooperate fully." "She drained our life while I was under anesthesia," I said quietly. "She stole more than money. She stole time I don't have." Something flickered behind his eyes, but it passed as quickly as it came. Marcy leaned in, her voice silk over steel. "We will be filing for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow. When it hits your inbox, I suggest you move fast, because if this reaches the press, you won't be known as the man who followed policy. You'll be known as the man who enabled deceit on a $250,000 scale." Colin's jaw tightened. "I will await the order," he said, standing as if the conversation had been neatly folded and filed away. But as we left, I caught his reflection in the glass wall, his face pale, eyes darting toward the folder Marcy had left behind like it was ticking. Outside, the heat hit me like a slap, but for the first time it felt clarifying. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about proving I still existed on paper, that I hadn't been erased clean from the story Grace had rewritten. The knock on my door came just after dawn. 3 firm raps that made the picture frames tremble slightly on the wall. 2 men stood on my porch in dark suits that looked like they had never known a wrinkle. The taller one flashed a badge so quickly it felt more like a warning than an introduction. "Mr. Stevens," he said. "Special Agent Keller, Bureau Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to ask you a few questions about a large-scale, unauthorized transfer tied to a property purchase in New York City." The words bureau and property purchase hung in the air together like the smell of burnt wire. I stepped aside and let them in. The living room suddenly looked smaller, like it had been caught pretending to be respectable. They didn't sit. Keller opened a folder, revealing a line of transaction printouts I knew too well. My accounts, my numbers, my name. "We've confirmed the funds were funneled through a shell trust connected to a real estate firm owned by Victor Lane," he said, "and that your wife, Grace Stevens, initiated the transfers using your credit authorization credentials. Did you give her permission?" My laugh came out thin and sharp, like broken glass in a paper bag. "I gave her a vow. Apparently that spends just as easily." The shorter agent, Ramirez, spoke for the first time. "We've subpoenaed her travel and communication records. She and Mr. Lane have been summoned to our field office tomorrow morning." "And if she refuses?" I asked. "She won't," Keller said flatly. "We have leverage." For a moment I felt an absurd flicker of pride, as if my misery had finally made the guest list for something official. Then it faded, leaving only the raw fact of it all. My wife, the woman who once cried over a burnt pie crust, was now the subject of a federal investigation. As they left, Keller paused at the door. "You did the right thing coming forward," he said. "Most people wait until the money's gone, and so are the people." "I thought they were already gone," I replied. "Turns out they just left fingerprints." When the door closed, the house fell back into silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the hollow kind, but the taut quiet of a bowstring being drawn. And maybe this is what separates collapse from recovery. Collapse leaves you hollow, but recovery sharpens you. Grace had started this like it was just another chapter of domestic unraveling, but she hadn't realized she'd walked straight into a revenge story. And this time, I was holding the pen. The courtroom was colder than I expected, as if justice required refrigeration. Rows of polished benches stretched behind me, but I barely registered the hum of whispers as the judge read the verdict in a voice that could have cut marble. "Property at 58W Morningside Avenue is to be seized by federal order. All assets transferred under fraudulent authorization will be returned to Mr. Robert Stevens. The defendant, Grace Stevens, is found guilty of financial fraud and conspiracy to launder funds through fictitious real estate channels." The words clattered through the air like loose change on stone. Grace stood 3 feet away, wrists bound lightly in front of her like she was just cold, not captured. Victor sat 2 rows behind, his face pale and stunned, as though someone had finally shown him a mirror he couldn't charm. She didn't look at me when the bailiff approached. She just straightened her spine, like pride might still pass for dignity. But when her eyes finally flicked my way, I saw something fractured behind them, a crack in the glass facade she'd spent months polishing. And for a moment I almost pitied her. Almost. "I once handed you my heart," I said softly, knowing she could read my lips even across the aisle. "And you chose to pick up a knife." The bailiff led her past, heels clicking on the tile like the last beats of an old song. The cameras caught her face, the reporters scribbled, and the judge stacked his papers like he was closing a file on a storm. But I knew better. This wasn't closure. It was a shift in gravity, because every tale of betrayal has that precise second when the floor gives way, when what seemed like a love story finally admits it was always about theft. And this, I realized, wasn't just about her fall. It was about my rise from beneath the rubble she left behind. In the echo of the gavel, the hush of the courtroom, something inside me steadied. Grace had written her part in this script with greed, but I had survived long enough to write the ending. And maybe that's what makes family drama so dangerous. When the masks come off, no one is just who they were. The water at Keystone Lake was the kind of calm that makes you whisper without meaning to. Early light stretched across the surface like a sheet of brushed silver, rippling only when Daniel's line sliced through it. We sat side by side on the old wooden dock, the boards soft and warm under the morning sun. The tackle box lay open between us, smelling faintly of rust and minnows, like childhood refusing to leave. My chest still ached sometimes when I reeled in too quickly, but today it felt more like a reminder than a warning. Daniel broke the silence first. Eyes fixed on the bobber. "I never doubted you," he said. Quiet, like it wasn't a declaration, just gravity. I let the words sit there, drifting on the air like one of the lake's herons gliding low. "That," I said, "is what kept me alive when everything else was trying to convince me I was already gone." He glanced at me then, smiling, just barely, like he was still half afraid I might crack if he used the full force of it. "Guess stubbornness runs in the family." "Stubbornness is just love with calluses," I replied. We watched the water a while longer, the silence no longer hollow, but full, like the house used to be, before the echo of lawyers and lies. The scandal had faded from the headlines now, filed away like it had happened to someone else. Grace's name was just ink on old court transcripts, and Victor's license had been suspended in a 2-sentence press release no one read twice. But here, the only thing that mattered was the quiet rhythm of the lake, and the way Daniel's laughter sounded when his line jerked suddenly, startling him into joy. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a man who had survived something. I just felt like someone's dad again. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon polish, and something like hope. It had been a month since the courtroom, and for the first time, the house didn't feel like a museum of broken things. I had replaced the cracked tile near the sink, repainted the cupboards, and fixed the squeaky hinge on the refrigerator door. On its door now hung a single photograph. Just Daniel and me, laughing in mismatched life jackets on a boat at Keystone Lake. The tape holding it up was crooked, but it felt like the most precise thing in the house. As I stood there, coffee cooling in my hands, I thought about how strange it was that life can collapse with the precision of an avalanche, and yet rebuild itself grain by grain, quietly, like sand drifting back to shore. I no longer checked the mail with dread. The statements were clean now, the accounts mine again. Grace's name had disappeared from them, replaced with rows of zeros that no longer felt like accusations. Victor had vanished from headlines too, swallowed by the next scandal in the city that had once seemed unreachable. But what stayed, what refused to move, was Daniel's trust. Through every hearing, every headline, every hollow night when even the furniture seemed to lean away from me, he never stepped back. That was the one thing Grace couldn't launder. I set the mug down, tracing the rim with my finger. Treasures can vanish, I thought, but the belief of your child, that's the only fortune worth guarding. Outside, autumn had begun to nibble at the edges of the yard, scattering gold leaves across the porch. Time was moving again, and for once, I wasn't trying to outrun it. Maybe that's the quiet truth buried inside all these family drama storms. Survival isn't loud. It's the sound of a hinge finally closing right, of laughter on a lake, of a heart deciding it will beat not out of defiance, but because it still has someone to beat for. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about it in the comments. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching, and may your days be gentle, your health steady, and your family close.